So it cannot be a more fitting time to discuss the 11th chapter from Congress's Reconsidered on Advise and Consent by Sarah A. Binder and Forrest Maltzman. President Trump has just recently nominated Judge Neil Gorsuch to the Supreme Court after President Obama's nominee, Judge Merrick Garland, did not receive a hearing to be considered by the Senate. To summarize a main theme from the authors and from our main textbook, which seems to fit in every week thus far, this comes down to partisanship and ideology. Knowing what we know from this chapter, and just studying the Congress at this time we're living in, it's no wonder that the authors note that after nearly a quarter of a century of senatorial foot-dragging and declining confirmation rates, advise and consent for judicial nominees remains a broken process. The authors also begin and end their chapter by noting that this is unlikely to subside soon. We know that that might actually be an understatement. From the start, the authors frankly note that the justices and judges who serve on the Supreme Court and the lower federal branch are in fact crafters of public law. The judiciary clearly is an active partner in the making of public policy. This is shocking, considering the judiciary wasn't really intended to do the making, but rather the interpreting. No wonder, then, that it is such an involving process, a battle even, to confirm these judges. The authors point to studies known as the Big Bang Theory and the Nothing New Under the Sun, both of which they discuss issues with. The former is described as a selection theory which points to a breaking point in national politics after which prevailing norms of deference and restraint in judicial selection fell apart. The result, according to partisans of the Big Bang, is a sea change in appointment politics, evidenced by the lengthening of the confirmation process and the rise in confirmation failure. The Nothing New Under the Sun theory suggests that the conflict has always been this political and ideological. The criticism with this is that it is only a starting point. Another fitting criticism is that it would be too difficult to explain the variation in trends if this polarization and partisanship had always been an effect. One relevant aspect of the tables on pages 269, 270, and 271 is the confirmation time, if nominees are even confirmed at all. Before the 1990s, it took less than 2 months to get confirmed. That seems amazing now. By the end of that decade, that meant 7 months for circuit court judges and 4 months for trial court judges. The authors mention how this pales in comparison with more recent nominees who didn't get confirmed, with failures waiting about a year and waiting in limbo for consecutive senates to not confirm them. That is where the authors acknowledge that the Nothing New Under the Sun theory is flawed. The authors lay out 4 forces to explain fate and factors of nominations. These include ideological forces, partisan forces, institutional forces, and the electoral context. It makes sense that these first 2 forces are linked and the most important. The authors point to what they call poison relations between Democrats in the Senate and President George W. Bush as where the slowdown may have happened. We hear of the Democrats' foot-dragging in this instance, but we'd also point to that which President Obama faced, knowing what we know now. The authors note that the rise of intense ideological differences between the 2 parties over the past 2 decades may directly affect the pace and rate of confirming new judges. Of course, that makes sense. They also note that it is not a surprise then that the Senate takes longer to confirm nominees during periods of divided control than during unified control, which is heightened by how judges have tenure for life. Another obvious point is that the partisanship is likely to affect nominations when there is already an even balance, and thus the appointment would tip the court. If confirmed, Gorsuch would be a conservative replacing a conservative. If a liberal Supreme Court Justice would be next to retire, however, there will likely be even more of a fight. Institutional tools have to do with the rules and practices of advise and consent. As the process goes, the nominee is first approved by the Senate Judiciary Committee. As a matter of tradition, senators from the nominee's home state take the lead, and if they are opposed, offer a blue slip. Polarization has gotten in the way so much, though, that such exceptions no longer have much formal power over whether or when to proceed in the confirmation process. The Senate Majority Leader is the one who sets the process, so when everyone is of the same party, this may happen very quickly. Otherwise, it may not happen at all. Another coinciding point from the other reading is the idea of filibusters, which may be the only option for the minority party. The authors fittingly note that as policy differences increase between the president and the opposing party, that party is more likely to exercise its power to delay nominees. The authors described elections as temporal forces. They suggest that delays encountered by judicial nominees may be a natural consequence of an approaching presidential election. We already know that from the election we just had. More recently, the objection might want to save vacancies so that a president of their own party could fill the vacancies with judges more in tune with the party's policy priorities. Well, isn't that a foretelling statement? When it comes to nominations for the Court of Appeals between 1961 and 2008, appointees during an election year were over 40% less likely to be confirmed. The confirmation process has also become more protracted over time, with the authors noting how important the courts have come to public policy and that opposing parties would be more aggressive about these nominations. The authors note that we should expect to find broader and heightened concern amongst politicians and political parties about the makeup of the bench. The authors note that answering such questions about the forces at play and various conflicts of nominees are consequential as they help us to evaluate how well the President and Senate discharge their constitutional duties of advise and consent. The examples of that variation are stunning. During the least polarized Senate since the early 1960s, which was the 92nd Congress of 1971 to 72, a nominee had a 99% likelihood of being confirmed. During what was, at the time, the most polarized Congress, which was the 109th Congress of 2005 to 2006, a nominee had a 33% chance. The authors affirm that nominations are less likely to be confirmed in periods of divided government. Would we expect parties which have taken increasingly polarized positions on major policy issues to give the other party's nominees an easy path to the bench? We would not. Table on page 278 shows that there are especially low confirmation rates when especially polarized parties divide up control of the branches. And yet, for all this mention, the authors still note that this has less than a 10% effect when accounting for all other forces. It seems that this can be explained then for how this is sort of base factor, with all other factors going along with it. Another way to tie this all together is through the idea of salience, which is how home state senators no longer are the only ones who matter. Those negative blue state slips no longer kill the nomination, recorded floor votes are the norm, and nominations now draw the attention of strategists within political parties. To counter the nothing new under the sun theory, the authors emphasize that the politics of judicial selection is shaped by today's more ideologically opposed parties over past recent decades, which strongly suggests that ideological differences between the parties encourage senators to exploit the rules of the game to their party's advantage in considering the president's nominees. This leads the authors to figure that if the courts were of little importance to the two parties, then polarized relations would matter little to senators and presidents in conducting advise and consent. We've all lived through the Obama administration years, but it's interesting how the authors point out that the issue of blocking nominees even extended to appellate and trial courts with him. The author suggests that Republican action against Obama's nominees may be just tit for tat from how Bush and his nominees were treated and even might be situational, though we shouldn't expect a change anytime soon, and I don't think any of us are. The chapter is relevant up until 2012, and as we can see, the situation seems to have gotten even more pronounced. People have lots of opinions on whether or not the Republican Senate majority abused or properly used their role of advise and consent in not giving Judge Garland even a hearing. I'm sure the authors would have made a mention of him. There's also how the Supreme Court was not only an election issue for 2016, but it was a top issue for many Trump voters. Living in the political world we are facing today, especially when it is broken down by the authors, it is hard to think of a more partisan, polarized, or ideological time in history, unless we are looking ahead to the future. It'll be curious to see how all of this affects Judge Gorsuch's nomination, which it likely will, and will perhaps even lead the Republicans to employ the nuclear option, which President Trump has already mentioned.